The boot was small, too small. It sat in the gray ash like it had been placed there carefully, like a child had simply stepped out of it and walked somewhere else. Dara Oren picked it up with both hands and held it for a long time. The leather was still warm from the heat the ground had not yet released. Colony Pharaoh had been a farming settlement, 3,000 people, grain fields that turned gold every harvest, a school with 17 students, a medical post that doubled as a community hall on festival nights. Nothing strategic, nothing worth destroying except as a message. The Breth Dominion had sent that message 6 days ago. Dara had been 2 systems away, picking up water filtration parts, when the signal went dead. She had flown back alone, faster than she should have, burning through fuel she could not replace. She had been telling herself the whole way that it would not be as bad as the silence suggested. People were terrible at sending updates during emergencies. Communication relays went down all the time. But there were no emergencies here anymore. There was only glass. The Breth used a compression weapon, something that superheated the air itself, turned everything on the surface to a flat, fused sheet. The fields were gone. The school was gone. The small medical post where old Dr. Benny's used to make bad tea and worse jokes was gone. Her husband's workshop was gone. Her daughters were gone. Dara set the boot down very carefully in the ash. She was not crying. She had cried for the first 4 days in the cockpit of her ship, alone, with no one to see her and nothing to do with her hands. She was done with that now. Something had shifted inside her. Some weight that had been pressing down had finally settled into a different shape. Not lighter, just different. She walked the ruins for 2 more hours. Not looking for survivors, the Breth were thorough. She was studying things, recording them in her mind with the same care she gave to engineering problems. The depth of the blast pattern, the direction of the force, the places where the compression wave had skipped slightly, revealing where buildings had stood. She was not sure why she was doing this. She only knew that she needed to see it fully, not through a report, not through images on a screen. She needed to stand in it, breathe the air of it, let it exist in her body as a real thing. People who had not walked through what remained of Pharaoh would be able to tell themselves it was not so bad, that lives could be rebuilt, that the Breth had sent a warning, not a statement, and maybe with careful diplomacy, things could be managed. Dara would not be able to tell herself that. She was standing in it. She knew exactly what it was. It was an ending that someone else had decided to give the people she loved. No vote, no negotiation, no consideration of who those people were or what they had built. 3,000 lives, canceled like a line in a ledger because the Breth Dominion wanted humanity to understand its position in the galaxy. They had been clear about that, at least. The message that came after the strike was almost polite. The Dominion expressed that it hoped humanity would take this event as an opportunity for reflection on the limits of expansion. It wished humanity a productive reconsideration of its colonial ambitions. It looked forward to continued communication. Humanity's government had issued a formal protest. Several alien councils had expressed concern. Ambassador Pell of the neutral Orath station had requested an emergency session of the Interstellar Forum. None of it would bring back Colony Pharaoh. None of it would bring back the boot's owner. Dara reached the eastern edge of the settlement, where the land sloped down toward what had been a river. The river was still there. That was the strange thing about rivers, they did not care about compression weapons. The water moved in the same way it always had. A bird she did not recognize was standing in the shallows, absolutely still, watching for fish. She watched the bird for a while. Then she turned around and walked back through the ruins toward her ship, not quickly, not with visible purpose. She walked the way she had always walked, the steady pace of someone used to covering ground. Her boots left prints in the ash. At the ship, she paused with her hand on the hatch. The comm system inside was basic long range, but basic. She could reach the nearest relay point from here. That relay connected to the main network. The main network reached everywhere, including the military post at Station Grade where Admiral Solon had been running coordination operations for the outer colonies. She had never met Solon. She knew his name because she had once filed a supply complaint with his office. He had actually written back personally. She had found that unusual enough to remember him. She opened the hatch, sat down, pulled the comm to her, and entered the frequency for Station Grade. She recorded her message while the ash settled outside the viewport. She did not raise her voice. She did not explain her loss or ask for sympathy. She described what she had observed in Colony Pharaoh with the precision of an engineer, and then she told Solon what she intended to do, with or without the fleet. She gave him her ship's identifier and sent it. Then she made herself eat something and waited. Outside, the bird had moved on. The river kept moving. The ash of Colony Pharaoh did not move at all. The Breth did not have a word for the specific kind of quiet that follows a warning well given. They had words for submission, for compliance, for the particular stillness of a species that had learned its place. What they were hearing from humanity sounded like all of those things. Counselor Rail decided, after reviewing 6 days of human communications, that it sounded like all of those things because it was all of those things. He closed the intelligence report and moved on to other business. He should have read it again. 2 systems from Colony Pharaoh, in the shadow of a moon that appeared on no Breth navigation chart. A human shipyard that had never officially existed was running on full power for the first time in its history. It had been built quietly, over 11 years, in response to a threat assessment that most of the human government had considered overly cautious at the time. The engineer who had designed it had been called paranoid. She had accepted that with a small, patient smile and gone back to work. Her name had been Dara Oren's mother. The shipyard was called nothing. It had no name. Names could be tracked. Admiral Solon stood inside its central bay and looked at what had been assembled in the 6 days since Pharaoh and felt a complicated thing move through his chest. He had been a fleet officer for 30 years. He had seen warships before. But these were not exactly warships. They were something that Dara had helped redesign in the 4 days between her arrival at Station Grade and the moment he had stopped arguing with her and started listening. She had walked into his briefing room with no rank, no credentials, and a set of technical drawings she had made by hand on the ship back. She had told him that the Breth's greatest weakness was not their firepower. It was their certainty. They had won every war they had fought by making the other species fight on Breth terms: direct engagement, formal battle lines, predictable escalation. Every species they had ever faced had followed the same pattern because every species they had ever faced had, in some way, respected the Breth enough to be afraid of them. Solon had asked what she was suggesting. She had told him. He had argued. She had waited for him to finish and then repeated what she had said more slowly. Now he was standing in the shipyard and watching the changes being made to 17 vessels, and he could not entirely decide if he was witnessing strategy or something older and more dangerous than strategy. On the other side of the galaxy, Tian filed his daily report. He was a junior intelligence analyst assigned to monitor human communication channels, generally considered dull work. Humans were not subtle communicators. They talked constantly, about everything, in dozens of languages, and most of it was irrelevant. His colleagues had long since stopped reading raw data and simply ran pattern filters that flagged anything militarily relevant. Tian still read the raw data. Something in the texture of human communication interested him in a way he could not explain. What he had noticed over the past 6 days was an absence, not of communication. Humans were still talking, but certain kinds of communication had stopped almost completely. The informal traffic between colony administrators and supply chains had dropped to near zero. The personal message networks that usually hummed with civilian noise had gone quiet in specific corridors. Not all corridors, specific ones. The ones that connected to outer manufacturing systems. He flagged it and wrote 3 paragraphs about what the pattern suggested to him. His supervisor reviewed it, noted that overall human communication volume was normal, and filed it as a non-event. Tian read his own report after it was filed. Then he opened a secondary file and started a private record. He did not know what he would do with it. He only knew something was happening in the data that no one around him wanted to look at, and he had a feeling he would want to have written things down. Ambassador Pell received a private message from a human diplomatic contact that simply said, "We are past the point of forum sessions. We wanted you to know before it becomes visible. We do not hold the Oreth responsible for the silence of other councils. We remember who tried." Pell read that message 5 times. Then they sent a request to the Interstellar Forum to postpone the emergency session indefinitely. When their aide asked why, Pell said only that the situation had changed and the session would no longer be useful. The aide asked in what direction it had changed. Pell looked at the message on the screen for a moment. Outside the viewport of their office, the slow lights of a dozen alien vessels moved through the station's traffic lanes, peaceful and routine, carrying trade and passengers and the ordinary business of a galaxy that did not yet know what was coming. "Irreversibly," Pell said. Back in the unnamed shipyard, Dara was checking power conduit alignments in the belly of the 3rd modified vessel when Solin's voice came over the comm. He told her the last material transfers had arrived. Everything she had requested was on site. They were ahead of schedule by 2 days. She did not respond immediately. She finished checking the conduit, made a small adjustment, and checked it again. Then she said, "Good, begin loading." The shipyard's lights, which had been running at half power to reduce the thermal signature, came to full brightness. Every worker on every level kept moving without pause. No one cheered. No one needed to. The Breth cargo convoy was moving through the Selin corridor on a standard resupply run when it stopped existing. There was no warning, no comm challenge, no declaration of intent. One moment there were 4 Breth logistics vessels moving in formation, and then a human ship came out of a fold jump so close that the sensor operators barely had time to register it before the first vessel's power core was disabled by a precision strike to its fuel regulation system. The second vessel lost propulsion. The third lost communications. The fourth, attempting to flee, found that the human ship had already repositioned behind it. The whole engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. No Breth lives were lost. The human vessel disabled every ship and then transmitted a single line on an open frequency before vanishing back into fold space. For Colony Pharaoh. Then it was gone. Voss received the report at his command post and read it 3 times. He had commanded Breth fleets for 22 years. He had participated in 6 species-level interventions. He had never received a battle report in which the enemy had been both devastating, and this was the word his analysts kept using, with visible discomfort, considerate. The human ship had disabled every vessel in a way that preserved the crew. It had not needed to do that. It was faster and better positioned. It could have destroyed all 4 ships in the same 4 minutes. It had chosen not to. Voss did not find this reassuring. He found it deeply, specifically troubling in a way he could not immediately articulate to his command staff. The strikes continued over the next 9 days, never in the same corridor, never with the same approach vector. 3 fuel depots were drained rather than destroyed. The fuel was taken. A communication relay was not blown up, but rather quietly recoded to broadcast a looping message on Breth military frequencies, the coordinates of Colony Pharaoh, and nothing else. A supply convoy carrying medical equipment was not touched at all. The convoy carrying weapons components was boarded, stripped of its cargo, and sent back with every crew member unharmed and a note attached to the command console that read, simply, "We remember what you took. We are taking back." Voss pulled Tian's old flagged report from the archived files. He read it. He called Tian's supervisor in and asked, with the careful quiet of someone choosing their words deliberately, why this report had been filed as a non-event. The supervisor said that overall communication volume had been normal. Voss dismissed him from the room and did not call him back. The War Council of the Vreth Dominion met in emergency session. Councillor Rael, who had ordered the strike on Colony Pharaoh, sat at the head of the table and listened to the damage assessments. The losses were not catastrophic. They were not even strategically significant yet. But something in the pattern bothered everyone in the room, though no one said it out loud until a junior strategist, speaking out of turn, said what everyone was thinking. The humans were not attacking their military. They were attacking their infrastructure. They were mapping the Dominion's supply nervous system and cutting specific nerves, not to kill, but to cause pain and confusion. And they were doing it while leaving enough witnesses alive that the Vreth could not claim ignorance of what was happening or pretend it was random. Rael issued the formal ultimatum. It was transmitted on every diplomatic and military frequency across 5 sectors. The Vreth Dominion demanded humanity cease all hostile action immediately, withdraw any vessels operating in Vreth-controlled space, issue a formal apology for the attacks, and submit to a renegotiation of territorial boundaries under Vreth oversight. Failure to comply within 72 hours would result in a full military response. The 72 hours passed. Humanity's government issued no statement. What arrived instead, from a human diplomatic relay, was a data packet addressed to every species in the Interstellar Forum. Inside was Ambassador Pell's compiled record, the record Pell had been building since before the first shot, which included the original Vreth message after the Pharaoh strike, the footage of what the compression weapon had done to a civilian settlement of 3,000 people, and a calm, detailed account of every human strike since, with special attention to the fact that 0 Vreth lives had been taken. The packet included no demands, no requests, just the record. Pell had titled it, "For the Consideration of the Forum." Within 6 hours, every alien species with observer status in the forum had acknowledged receipt. Several had responded with brief, cautious messages of their own. None of them were defending the Vreth. In the Vreth War Council, someone finally said the thing that had been circling the room for days. They said, "They gave us a warning. Every strike was a warning. They have been waiting for us to stop." Rael looked at that person for a long moment. Then he ordered Voss to begin full military mobilization. His voice was steady. His hands under the table were not. At station grade, Solon received confirmation that the full Vreth fleet was moving. He walked to the comm room and sent Dara a single message. "It is going to be a real war now." Her reply came back in under a minute. "Good, we are ready." There was a planet in the Vreth Outer Territories called Sarath. It had a population of 400,000 mostly civilians, farmers, low-level administrative workers. It had no significant military value. What it had was a natural deep space harbor that Voss had quietly filled with 7 warships and 200 soldiers, then positioned them inside the civilian population centers in such a way that any strike on the military assets would also hit homes, schools, and hospitals. Voss broadcast the arrangement publicly on all frequencies. He stated, with professional calm, that this was a legitimate defensive posture, and that any human attack on Sarath would be an attack on its civilian population. He believed this would stop humanity cold. Every other species the Vreth had ever maneuvered this way had stopped cold. The human fleet arrived 12 hours later. It did not fire. Instead, it broadcast a message to every comm device on the planet's surface personal units, public terminals, emergency systems. The message was in the local Vreth dialect, translated with the help of someone who clearly knew the language well. It told the population of Sarath exactly where each military installation was located, down to the city block. It told them that they had 72 hours to evacuate those specific areas. It told them that their lives were not the target. It told them that the ships in orbit would wait. Then the human fleet held its position and waited. Voss watched his own civilian population moving away from the military sites and felt something inside him that was not quite fear and not quite anger. It was the feeling of a plan being turned inside out. He had used civilians as a shield, and the humans had responded by helping them move out of the way. He ordered the warships to attack the human fleet from within the civilian zones, counting on the humans to break off rather than return fire near populated areas. The human fleet absorbed the attack, pulled back out of range, and held position. No return fire. A second message was sent to Serath's civilians. Stay in your homes, away from the military sites, and you will not be harmed. We will still wait. The civilians of Serath, who had not chosen this war, and who were watching Vreth warships fire from inside their neighborhoods, began to do something the Vreth High Command had not anticipated. They started calling the warship commanders and asking them to leave. Voss pulled the warships back to the orbital harbor and watched from space as the human fleet precisely dismantled his ground installations over the next 6 hours without a single civilian casualty. He watched every impact on the tactical screen. Each strike was exact. Not a building outside the military perimeter was touched. He filed a report to Rail that used the word unprecedented 4 times. He did not have better words. Tian had been watching all of it from Pell's neutral station, where he had been quietly relocating for the past week with Pell's careful assistance. He did not celebrate what he saw. He sat with it, the same way he had been sitting with everything he had observed about humans since this began. There was something happening here that the Vreth military machine could not process because they had no category for it. Humans were not showing mercy out of weakness. They were not holding back because they could not strike harder. They were showing exactly how precisely they could fight while simultaneously refusing to be the kind of people who killed civilians to make a point. It was, Tian wrote in his private record, the most frightening thing he had ever observed. Not because humans were cruel, because they were not, and they still would not stop. Then Rail made his decision. The order went to a Vreth Rapid Strike Team, not the main fleet, not Voss, a separate unit that answered directly to the Council. The target was a human colony called Aldris Station. Population, 900, a transit hub, ordinary people. The strike took 11 minutes. When it was over, Aldris Station was Colony Pharaoh all over again. Dara was in the middle of a targeting review when Solan's voice came over the comm. He read her the initial casualty estimates. His voice was steady in the way that people who have been soldiers for a long time learn to hold their voices steady when they should not be. She set down the data pad she was holding. She was quiet for long enough that Solan said her name. "I am here," she said. "I want you to take a minute before you respond to this." She looked out the viewport at the dark between stars. She thought about the boot, small and warm in the ash of Colony Pharaoh. She thought about her daughters. She thought about the people of Serath who had called the warships and asked them to leave. She thought about what she had spent weeks building and why. Solan had once told her that restraint was the thing that separated a war from a massacre. She had agreed with him. She still agreed with him. The difference was that she no longer believed restraint had to mean what it had meant before. "No more pulling back," she said. "We go for the fleet directly. No more infrastructure. We end their ability to fight." Solan did not argue. He had been a soldier long enough to know when a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. He just said, "Understood." Outside, the fleet began to reposition. No announcement, no ultimatum, they simply moved. The Vreth had a strategic doctrine called the Iron Enclosure. It had won 11 wars. The principle was simple. When an enemy moved against you, you let them advance until they were committed, then closed your larger fleet around them from 3 directions simultaneously, cutting off retreat and supply. Every species that had ever faced the Iron Enclosure had either surrendered inside it or been destroyed inside it. The Vreth had never needed a backup plan because the iron enclosure had never failed. What the iron enclosure required was that the enemy moved in a predictable direction. Voss initiated it the moment the human fleet began advancing on the Vreth outer defense line. He moved his 3 fleet groups into position with the quiet efficiency of long practice. He gave the enclosure 40 minutes to close. He watched the tactical display with something close to relief. The humans had finally, after weeks of unpredictable behavior, committed to a direct engagement. They were doing exactly what a conventional enemy would do, advancing in force on the nearest military target. The iron enclosure would catch them, and this would be over. At the 38-minute mark, the tactical display began showing information that made no sense. The human fleet had not advanced to the defense line. It had split, not into 2 groups, into 9 independent strike formations, each one moving at a different speed toward a different target, none of them the targets Voss had anticipated. 2 were heading around the defense line entirely. 3 were making directly for the Vreth fleet groups that formed the arms of his enclosure. 1 was moving toward the military shipyard at Voreth Prime. 1 was heading somewhere his sensors did not immediately identify, until a junior officer quietly said it was the fuel processing complex at Dina Station, the facility that supplied 60% of the entire outer Vreth fleet. The last 2 formations were unaccounted for. His sensors could not find them. Voss stood at the tactical display and watched his iron enclosure become 9 separate emergencies at once. He had 30 warships. The humans had split their attention across 9 fronts, which should have meant each front was manageable. But the strike groups had been sized with uncomfortable precision, each one just large enough to overwhelm the local response if Voss tried to cover everything, and just spread enough that concentrating his force on anyone would leave 4 others unchallenged. He could not chase all 9. He could not ignore any of them. He made choices. He had to. Commanders who did not make choices in this situation lost everything. He chose the shipyard and the fuel complex as the highest priorities and sent his strongest groups there. Dara had anticipated exactly those choices. The 2 groups he could not find on his sensors were waiting behind Voreth Prime's moon. They let his reinforcements pass, then hit the shipyard from behind while his reinforcement fleet was still decelerating. Voreth Prime Shipyard, the largest military construction facility in the Vreth Outer Territories, was offline within 2 hours. Dina Station's fuel complex took longer. The Vreth defense there was fierce. 3 human ships were destroyed. Solon, watching the engagement from the command vessel, sent a reinforcement. Dara countermanded it, redirected it to cover the eastern flank, and the fuel complex fell by the end of the day. Solon did not argue with the countermand. She had been right about too many things. On the neutral station, Pell was transmitting live. They had not planned to. They had been filing reports with a time delay, the careful, measured record of an observer. But when the scale of what was happening became clear, Pell had opened a direct feed to every forum member that had acknowledged the earlier data packet. They watched in real time as 9 human formations moved with an efficiency that the forum's military analysts, watching alongside diplomats, kept describing with the same word: deliberate, not frantic, not lucky, deliberate. As though someone had spent weeks designing exactly this moment for exactly this enemy. In the forum observation channel, one analyst from a species called the Marath, a people who had submitted to the Vreth 70 years ago and had never fully recovered from it, simply transmitted the same short message 3 times in a row. They planned this from the start. Tian watched the feed alongside Pell and said nothing for a long time. He was watching specifically for something he had not seen from human forces in this entire war. He watched for the moment they overextended, pushed past their objectives, got angry and started hitting things that were not on the list. Every other species Tian had studied did that eventually. Anger made them sloppy. It made them cruel. It made them make mistakes. The human formations hit every pre-identified target and pulled back. No excess. No extra strikes. Even now, even after Aldris Station, they were not burning things that did not need to burn. He updated his private record. He wrote, "They are controlled because they chose to be. It is not that they feel less. It is that they decided before any of this started what kind of people they were going to be, and they have not let go of that decision, not even now." On the Breth flagship, Voss stood in front of a tactical display showing the wreckage of 11 hours of engagement. He had lost the shipyard, the fuel complex, 2 fleet groups, and a significant portion of his long-range strike capability. He had not lost the war yet, but he understood, standing there, that what he had lost was the ability to win it. He sent a message to Rail marked urgent. They knew exactly what we would do. The ruins of Colony Pharaoh had not changed. No one had come to clear them. No government crew had arrived to flatten the glass and pour new foundations. Dara had asked, in the only formal request she had made to any human authority during the entire war, that the ruins be left exactly as they were. She had not explained why. Nobody had asked her to. She landed her ship in the same spot she had landed it months ago, on the flat ground at the edge of what had been the settlement's eastern boundary. She walked in through the same path she had always walked. The ash had hardened in the time since wind and occasional rain had given it a crust that crunched slightly underfoot. The river was still there, still moving the same way. She was not alone this time. Solon had come with her. He stood a few steps back and to the left, the way he always stood when he understood that a moment did not belong to him. The war had been over for 19 days. Not a human victory the way old stories described victories, flags, and crowds, and the feeling of something finished. More like a machine slowly running out of fuel. The Breth outer fleet had collapsed after Voreth Prime and Dina Station. Their inner defense line held 3 more weeks, but without resupply it was a defense against time. Voss had requested cessation through Ambassador Pell. Humanity agreed on specific conditions. Rail was standing in front of a galactic tribunal, not a human one. Pell's record, transmitted live to every forum observer during the final engagement, had made it impossible for the broader community to treat this as a bilateral dispute. The tribunal had species from 4 different systems on its panel. 2 of them had themselves once been on the receiving end of Breth diplomatic messages. They were not lenient. Tian had submitted a formal account of everything he had observed and recorded to the tribunal. He had done it voluntarily, without immunity negotiation, without conditions. When Pell asked him why he had not tried to protect himself first, he said that protecting himself was not the most important thing happening. Pell had filed that quote in the record alongside everything else. The Breth Dominion still existed. Humanity had not tried to end it. The terms of cessation required the withdrawal of Breth forces from 17 claimed territories, reparations to affected colonies, a formal acknowledgement of what had been done to Pharaoh and Aldris Station, and mandatory participation in a forum oversight process for a period of 40 years. Rail had called the terms humiliating. His own counsel had told him, in a session that was apparently not as private as he had intended, that humiliation was a significant improvement over what they had been facing. The galactic community had passed a resolution. It did not offer humanity protection. Humanity had declined to request protection, which had caused an unusual amount of confused discussion in the forum. It formally acknowledged humanity as a peer-level species within the galactic community, removed several of the informal limitations on human expansion that had been in place for decades, and included, at Pell's insistence, a single added line that had no legal weight but that Pell felt needed to be in the record. The line read, "The forum notes that humanity, during a period of direct military engagement, maintained a consistent policy of minimizing civilian harm to all parties including the aggressor, and that this policy was maintained without formal negotiation, external pressure, or institutional requirement. It was a choice. Dara stood in the ruins for a long time without speaking. Solon did not rush her. He looked at the hardened ash and the open sky above it and thought about all the things he might say and said none of them, because none of them were adequate. Eventually, Dara reached into the bag she had carried from the ship. She took out a small square of metal cut and smoothed by hand, with a single word pressed into it. Not the names of the dead, not a date or a number or a statement, just the name of the place itself. Pharaoh. She pressed it into the ash at the edge of what had been the settlement's central path, so that it stood upright and could be read by anyone walking in. She did not make a speech over it. She stepped back and looked at it for a moment. Then she picked up her bag and walked back toward the ship. Solon fell into step beside her. After a while he said quietly, "What do we do now?" It was not a strategic question. She understood that. He meant after this. After the kind of thing you spend months being entirely consumed by, and then suddenly it is done and there is a morning with no objective in it. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about engineering problems. You assessed the current state. You identified what still needed doing. You started there. Same thing we were doing before, she said. Build things, feed people, fix what is broken. She glanced at him. The colony sites abandoned during the conflict need infrastructure assessments. I have the certifications. I was doing it before Pharaoh and I can do it again. Solon nodded slowly. They walked in silence for a while. That is a very ordinary answer, he said. Yes, she said, it is. She climbed the ramp into her ship without looking back at the ruins. The marker stood in the hardened ash behind her, catching the light. The river moved past it the same way the river had always moved. Steady, unhurried, and entirely indifferent to the things that empires thought were permanent.